The sun had just risen above the distant tree line, casting a golden shimmer over the gently flowing creek that sliced through the rear of my 20-acre ranch like a glimmering ribbon of peace. That creek was more than just water to me. It was history, memory, and the very breath of the land. For generations, my family had lived on this property, the creek serving as a natural boundary, a lifeline for livestock, and a source of calm during the most chaotic of days. Its gentle babble had echoed through my childhood, a constant in a world that refused to stay the same. But the HOA, that overbearing hive of clipboard tyrants, had a different vision for the land, one that didn't include the sanctity of nature or respect for long-standing property lines. They came in smiling, armed with legalese and smug attitudes, claiming they had a community improvement project that might slightly adjust some water features. I should have known then. Nothing good ever follows a statement like that. At first, the HOA's moves were small. They began showing up near the edge of my property, walking the fence line, snapping photos of the creek. When I asked what they were doing, they responded with vague comments about environmental assessments. I wasn't opposed to responsible stewardship of the land, but I knew the difference between genuine care and nosy control. Then came the letters, official notices warning of unregulated water diversion and suggesting that my creek was somehow violating HOA guidelines, despite the fact my ranch had existed long before their cookie-cutter neighborhood even broke ground. I laughed them off at first, figuring they were just flexing their authority. I had no idea they were preparing for something far more destructive. The day the bulldozers arrived is forever etched in my mind. I had just returned from the feed store when I spotted the blinking lights and diesel exhaust pouring into the air near the back of my property. At first, I thought it was county work, maybe some kind of emergency repair. But as I approached, I saw the HOA logo plastered across the side of a white pickup truck. A group of hired contractors was already ankle-deep in mud, redirecting the course of the creek. My creek. One of them was operating a small excavator, scooping water and sediment into a channel they had carved toward the neighboring subdivision. I was floored, enraged. I stormed toward them, demanding answers, but the project manager coolly informed me that under Section 9B of the Environmental Flow Reclassification Guidelines, they were within their rights to restructure natural water paths to accommodate emergency flood mitigation. It sounded official. It also sounded like total garbage. That night, I pored over documents, county permits, and every HOA regulation I could get my hands on. They had filed for a provisional rezoning of the floodplain, citing the need for increased drainage to prevent seasonal pooling in their subdivision. And the kicker? They had falsely claimed that my creek was an unnamed ditch, devoid of ecological or historical significance. It was bureaucratic theft at its worst. What they didn't realize was that in trying to fix their water issues, they had not only trespassed onto my land, they had messed with something they couldn't control. Nature. In the weeks that followed, things spiraled. The creek that once ran clean and cool became muddy, turbulent, and overburdened. Their crude river diversion channeled runoff into areas it was never meant to touch. Beavers abandoned their lodges. Songbirds grew silent. Worse, my lower pastures, now flooded, began eroding. I documented everything: drone footage, time-stamped photos, water samples. When I sent cease and desist letters to the HOA, they responded with accusations, claiming I had obstructed a critical water project and threatened fines. It was like trying to reason with a dam made of red tape and arrogance. Then came the tipping point. One rainy weekend, a massive storm hit our area. Sheets of water hammered the ground for 48 straight hours, saturating the earth and putting every drainage system to the test. While my ranch weathered the storm, as it always had, the newly dug river in the HOA's subdivision didn't fare so well. Their forced channel, steep, shallow, and poorly reinforced, became a raging torrent. The artificial riverbanks they'd carved collapsed like sugar in the rain. One by one, backyards from the HOA development began to slough off into the new waterway. Decks, fences, even patios crumbled. The land, unsteady from their own meddling, gave way beneath them. By dawn, 3 homes had suffered foundation damage. 2 had sunk so dramatically that rescue crews were dispatched. I stood on my porch, staring at the wreckage from afar, not with satisfaction, but with a grim sense of inevitability. I had tried to warn them. They had laughed. Now the land had answered for me. That morning, a swarm of trucks descended on the subdivision. Civil engineers, insurance reps, reporters. The HOA president, a smug man named Gerald Bellamy, stood in his driveway, soaked to the bone, barking at a news crew that unforeseen soil instability was to blame. Lies on top of lies. I made sure to hand my full case file to the county inspector personally. Photos, videos, even emails from the HOA themselves admitting they'd gone ahead without final permits. His eyes widened as he thumbed through the evidence. He promised an investigation. I promised to escalate if the county didn't act fast. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to spin the story. They blamed natural erosion, claimed I had manipulated the creek to retaliate, and even tried to get a restraining order to keep me from walking near the diverted water line. It was laughable, but I knew better than to just laugh. I needed a long game. So I reached out to a friend of mine who worked in environmental law. Together we filed for an emergency injunction against further land alteration and launched a civil suit for damages and trespassing. And that was just the beginning. What the HOA didn't realize, what they never took the time to understand, was that tampering with nature has consequences. Not just legal, not just personal, but elemental. The creek wasn't a line on a map. It was a living thing, and when they forced it out of balance, they had doomed themselves to consequences far beyond HOA penalties or angry letters. They had waged war against the land, and now the land was fighting back. As I stood beneath the cottonwoods, listening to the altered water roar through their crumbling subdivision, I made a promise, not just to myself, but to my ancestors who had tended this land with quiet reverence. I wouldn't stop. Not until every last lie was exposed, every damage repaid, and every inch of my land restored. They had pushed too far. Now it was my turn to push back, with truth, with law, and, if needed, with every ounce of grit I had in me. The devastation wasn't just visible, it was seismic. You could feel it in the air. The once smug HOA board, clad in their pressed shirts and fake smiles, had vanished behind walls of lawyers and public statements. The subdivision they once lorded over had turned into a muddy, broken, waterlogged disaster zone, with homes teetering on unstable earth, lawns sunken into pits, and fences now serving as twisted reminders of hubris. What they'd done to my creek, the very vein of this land, had come back with a fury none of them had prepared for. But for me, it was just the beginning of a broader fight. They might have written me off as a solitary landowner with an old waterway, but now I had a different image. I was the man who had nature, law, and truth on his side. Immediately after the illegal diversion came to light, I filed for an emergency injunction. My legal team, led by Rachel Graves, an environmental litigator with a spine of steel, moved fast. We submitted photographic evidence, aerial drone footage, emails from the HOA contradicting public statements, and, perhaps most damning of all, a private geotechnical report warning the HOA that this project could destabilize the hillside. Rachel stood before the judge like a hammer in human form. Within 72 hours, the court ruled in my favor. All construction ceased. Access to my land was restricted. The HOA was barred from even approaching the creek. I'd won a critical battle, but the war was still escalating. Inside the HOA, panic reigned. I later obtained a transcript of their emergency board meeting, thanks to a brave homeowner who leaked the audio. President Gerald Bellamy opened the meeting shouting accusations. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he barked. "Our consultants said this was fine." But the blame game had begun. Some blamed the engineers, others the contractors. A few had the gall to suggest I had somehow set them up, as though I had conjured a landslide and a flood from thin air. Meanwhile, the damage deepened. Rain that spring was relentless. The new water channel couldn't handle the runoff. Homes closest to the man-made river experienced major erosion. One luxury home, valued at nearly $900,000, was red-tagged and condemned after half its foundation buckled. The owner, a retired veteran named Carl Myers, confronted the board in tears. "You stole my home," he said, trembling. "I trusted you people." They didn't have an answer. At this point, I wasn't just dealing with personal loss. I was watching neighbors, some guilty, some innocent, lose their security, their equity, even their safety. It became clear that this wasn't just about me anymore. So I took a step further. With Rachel's help, I filed a civil lawsuit, not just for personal damages, but as a class action. I reached out to affected homeowners. 7 signed on initially. Within weeks, that number swelled to 17. Some feared retaliation, others were worried about litigation costs. I covered legal fees up front, assuring them this wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. But the HOA wasn't ready to go down without a fight. They hired a PR firm, launched a slick website with curated drone shots of undamaged homes, and issued press releases blaming an unexpected geologic event. They described me as an obstructionist landowner who refused to work with the community. It would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. They were playing public relations poker while people's homes were cracking in half. And then came the smoking gun. A woman named Denise Warner, a single mother of 2 whose house had suffered water damage and a partial deck collapse, walked up my driveway one gray morning holding a thick manila envelope. Inside were internal HOA communications, including one email from Bellamy himself acknowledging the risk. The creek may become unstable during high rainfall. However, if we keep this quiet and maintain PR optics, the long-term benefit outweighs short-term risk. He had signed it with a smug little smiley face emoji. It made my blood boil. They knew. They'd known all along. With Denise's documents, we filed a motion to depose the entire HOA board under oath. The court approved it. Rachel grilled Bellamy like a seasoned warrior. "Did you authorize work without a permit?" she asked. Bellamy stammered. "Did you ignore warnings from your own hired engineers?" He looked at his lawyer. "Is this your signature acknowledging fault 3 weeks before the landslide?" Silence. The court reporter typed it all with calm detachment, but I watched his face crumble. Still, the land was the loudest witness. The artificial river they'd dug became a brown serpent after every rainfall, slamming into soil that once stood firm for centuries. Tree roots were exposed like ribs torn from a chest. Native animals disappeared. Foxes, rabbits, and even deer had retreated, driven off by the turbulence and the chainsaws. The old creek, my creek, was reduced to a trickle choked by sediment and red clay. I remember standing at its edge, remembering childhood summers spent fishing its eddies, watching frogs hop between stones. Now all that beauty was strangled, but healing was possible, if done right. I brought in environmental experts, hydrologists, and even indigenous stewards familiar with the land's original flow. They helped design a restoration plan using willow bundles, root balls, and erosion mats to heal the creek's wounds. We didn't bulldoze. We coaxed it back to life. Over time, the birds returned. The water turned clear again. The air began to smell like spring instead of stagnant sludge. I had saved it, but not without cost. The HOA, on the other hand, unraveled faster than anyone could have predicted. Their insurance company refused to cover the damage once fraud and unpermitted activity were proven. Contractors sued them for unpaid bills. 2 board members resigned and left the subdivision altogether. Gerald Bellamy tried to file bankruptcy, only to be named in a secondary criminal investigation for falsifying public documents. Karma, as they say, flows faster than water. And the community? It fractured. Meetings once filled with chatter and block party plans now turned into bitter shouting matches. Residents debated whether to disband the HOA entirely. Some wanted to salvage it under new leadership. Others were done with the very idea of homeowner control. One night, someone spray-painted. Drained the swamp on the HOA clubhouse in blood-red paint. It was vandalism, sure, but it also felt like a cry of desperation. 6 months after the injunction, the county convened a hearing on whether to revoke the HOA's charter. My team submitted a 700-page dossier outlining their illegal acts. Environmental officials confirmed the long-term damage. Homeowners testified, often tearfully. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. The HOA was dissolved, their powers stripped, their records archived as part of a public environmental negligence case. The land they once ruled now stood free. As for me, I didn't stop at just fixing my creek. I purchased adjoining plots of land as they came up for sale, converting them into a private conservation zone. I partnered with a local university to turn part of the area into a research site for erosion studies. The name of the project? Bellamy Bend, a reminder of what happens when arrogance tries to rewrite natural laws. I even invited former HOA members to visit the site if they wished to see what real stewardship looked like. Most declined. Only one, an elderly woman who had voted against the diversion, came. She stood beside me on the creek bank and whispered, "I hope they learn something from this. I really do." To this day, the signs remain, literal ones, posted along the perimeter. Private property, protected watershed, trespassers prosecuted. But there's also a wooden plaque nestled near the creek, carved from a cedar tree that had fallen during the storms. It reads, "The earth remembers, and the creek returns." This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a reckoning for anyone who believed power, greed, and paperwork could override common sense and respect for nature. The HOA tried to reroute a creek. Instead, they rerouted their entire future into lawsuits, condemnations, and collapse. They had no idea the land they dismissed would be the very force to swallow them whole, and I had no idea how many people would stand with me when the truth came flooding in. But now I do, and I'll never forget it.